October 25, 1944. 6:44 in the morning, east of the island of Samar in the Philippine Sea. On the bridge of the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay, a signalman scans the northern horizon and sees masts. At first he thinks they belong to friendly ships that fell behind in the night. But the masts are too tall, there are too many of them, and they move in a column no American formation uses. A minute later, he makes out a shape nothing else looks like, the pagoda superstructures found only on the heavy ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy. A minute after that, the largest of the silhouettes rises fully above the haze, and the officers on the bridge understand they are looking at a ship that, by every calculation, should not be here. This is Yamato, the largest battleship ever built by human hands. 862 feet long, close to 70,000 tons at full load. 9 guns of 18.1-inch caliber, each able to throw an armor-piercing shell weighing nearly 1.5 tons across 26 miles. Beside her come 3 more battleships and a column of heavy cruisers, all of it moving straight toward a handful of ships never meant to fight battleships at all. 6 escort carriers converted from merchant hulls, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Thin plating, small guns, crews many of whom had never seen a major surface battle. By 10 o'clock this morning, more than 1,000 American sailors will be dead or dying in the water. And the strongest fleet Japan could still assemble in 1944 will turn around and leave an almost defenseless target behind it. The official picture of that morning was simple. A powerful Japanese force caught a defenseless American escort and should have wiped it out in half an hour.
What actually happened was different. The Japanese commander, with almost everything left of the Empire's battle line in front of him, looked at the thin, doomed ships charging straight at him and reached a conclusion that turned the whole battle over. He decided those ships could not possibly be what they appeared to be. To understand how the weakest side won the most lopsided naval action of the war, you have to go back one day to a decision made by a man hundreds of miles away. A man who would not even be present at Samar. By October of 1944, the American advance across the Pacific had reached the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, who had promised back in '42 that he would return, was landing the 6th Army on the island of Leyte. Troops were already going ashore, and the anchorage held transports, barges, landing craft, hospital ships. All of it was vulnerable for exactly as long as the fleet protected it.
For Japan, the Philippines meant the final reckoning. If the Americans held here, they would cut the sea lane that carried oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japanese factories and into the tanks of Japanese ships. Without that oil, Japan could not keep its fleet at sea, and the war would end on a timetable set by fuel tanks. So the Japanese command committed almost everything still afloat and built a plan that handed its own aircraft carriers the role of live bait. The plan was called Shogo, Operation Victory. It was complex and desperate. A force under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, with almost no trained carrier pilots left, was to appear north of the Philippines and play the lure. Its single job was to draw off the main American striking power, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet, with its fast carriers and battleships. While Halsey chased the bait north, the main Japanese force, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, would slip through the San Bernardino Strait in the dark, come out off Samar, and fall on the defenseless transports at Leyte. The whole plan rested on one assumption, that Halsey would take the empty carriers and lead his fleet away. And Halsey took them. Here begins what would later be called one of the costliest mistakes in the history of the American Navy. On the evening of October 24th, scouts reported Japanese carriers to the north. For an admiral who dreamed of finishing off the remnants of Japanese carrier aviation, this was the target of the whole war. He turned the entire Third Fleet north, every fast carrier, all 6 of his newest battleships, the whole screen, and led them after Ozawa. He left nothing at the San Bernardino Strait. Not one battleship, not one cruiser, not one destroyer standing guard. The strait, through which Kurita was already moving in the darkness, was left wide open. Worse still, no one on the American side really knew who was responsible for what. The 7th Fleet, under Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, covering the landing, believed Halsey had left a screen of fast battleships at the strait, a force called Task Force 34. Halsey believed that guarding the strait was not his concern once carriers appeared in front of him. Each of the two commanders assumed the other was plugging the hole. Into that gap between two staffs, into a zone each one counted as the other's responsibility, came a Japanese force of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, 23 ships in all. Waiting in their path that morning, east of Samar, stood an escort group with the call sign Taffy 3. The ships of Taffy 3 were never built for a fight like this.
6 escort carriers of the Casablanca class: Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay. They were built fast and cheap in Henry Kaiser's yards on merchant hulls, with thin, unarmored plating and a single 5-inch gun in the stern. Sailors called them jeep carriers, and they read the abbreviation CVE as Combustible, Vulnerable, Expendable. A carrier like that made about 19 knots. Kurita's battleship Congo could make over 30. In practice, that meant one simple thing. Taffy 3 could neither outrun the Japanese nor trade an honest gunfight with them. Inside those thin hulls were men who had woken that morning fully certain that the day's work was launching aircraft to support the infantry ashore, not fending off battleships with main-caliber fire. Between the carriers and the Japanese column stood 7 small screening ships, and all the hope rested on them. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, Johnston, Hole, and Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts, smaller and lighter still, Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond. A Fletcher destroyer ran 376 feet, displaced about 2,100 tons, and carried 5 single 5-inch guns. A destroyer escort was humbler still, around 1,400 tons and 2 5-inch guns. Their main weapon was the torpedo, and the torpedo was the one thin chance these little ships had to do anything to an armored giant. A 5-inch shell bounced off the belt of a heavy cruiser. A torpedo could open a hull below the waterline, where there is almost no armor. To launch torpedoes, you had to close to within a few miles under the fire of guns the destroyer's plating could not stop at all. One of these destroyers became the central figure of the morning. Johnston, hull number 557, was launched in Seattle and commissioned on October 27th of 43, 1 year less 2 days before the action off Samar.
Her captain was Commander Ernest Evans. Evans was born in Oklahoma, of Cherokee family, and was, by available record, the 3rd Native American to graduate from the Naval Academy. On the day Johnston raised her flag, Evans said words to the crew that would be quoted for decades. He said this was going to be a fighting ship, that he intended to go in harm's way, and that anyone who did not want to come along had better get off right now. Before Samar, Johnston had already seen combat, shelling beach positions at Kwajalein and Eniwetok, covering landings, hunting submarines off Bougainville. The crew already knew their captain under fire. A year after that speech, he would keep his promise to the letter, down to the last comma. On Johnston that morning served Lieutenant Robert Hagan, the gunnery officer, and it was he who left the fullest account of this ship and her men. By his telling, the year before Samar passed as routine. 300-odd men lived inside a steel hull about 40 feet across, slept in compartments where bunks hung 3 and 4 high, against bulkheads that in the tropics baked from the sun and the heat of the machinery. At the boilers in the engine rooms, the temperature held far past 120 degrees. Fresh water, rationed, was often too scarce even to wash the salt off skin. In battle, each of these tight compartments could become a trap. One hit in the engine room, and men were sealed in alone with steam, fire, and seawater. On the morning of October 25th, by Hagan's account, Evans remarked to his executive officer that they were 3 days short of the ship being a year old, and that it had been an uneventful year. He said this 50-some miles off Samar, a few hours before the uneventful year ended. The crews of Taffy 3 had been worked to the bone for weeks by then, launching aircraft from dawn to dark, sleeping in their clothes by the guns.
Many of the men who stood to the 5-inch mounts and torpedo tubes that morning had never seen a real surface battle against a major enemy. They had been trained to fight submarines and screen convoys. In a few hours, they would meet 4 battleships. The night of October 25th was dark, with rain squalls that hid the horizon and then opened it again. The crews of Taffy 3 caught fragments of radio traffic from the Surigao Strait, where another battle had run all night to the south, and they knew something large was happening close by. But they expected no direct threat to themselves. The whole American fleet was covering them, they were sure. At dawn, Johnston steamed on an ordinary screening course, ready for a routine day of supporting the landing. At 6:47, Yamato's radar picked up a group of ships to the southeast, and within minutes, the Japanese opened fire on what they took for a major American formation.
The first shell splashes from main-caliber guns went up around the escort carriers. The splashes were colored. The Japanese loaded dye into their shells so they could tell whose salvo fell where: pink, yellow, green, purple. Around the thin carriers, columns of dyed water rose higher than the masts. By those colors, the men of Taffy 3 understood they were under fire, not from anything small, but from the heavy guns of battleships and cruisers. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, faced a problem with no solution. He could not run. His carriers were slower than the Japanese ships and would be caught within an hour. He could not stand and trade gunfire. His guns did not pierce their armor. He had 2 tools left: smoke and aircraft. Sprague ordered the carriers to turn south toward the nearest rain squall, lay a smoke screen, and put up everything that could fly, even aircraft armed not with anti-ship weapons, but with whatever was left from ground support: fragmentation bombs, depth charges, sometimes only machine guns. And he gave an order to the destroyers and destroyer escorts of the screen. That order meant near certain death for the men who carried it out, and everyone who heard it knew so. But before it reached them all, Johnston was already attacking. Evans did not wait for the command. When the first salvos straddled the carriers, Evans swung his destroyer around and drove it straight at the Japanese column, laying smoke as he went to hide the carriers behind it. Johnston's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagan, who through the sight of his director saw a ship 6 times the size of his own, later put the feeling into one phrase that became part of the legend of the battle. He said they felt like Little David, only without a slingshot. For 20 minutes, Johnston could not even reply. The Japanese guns reached farther than her 5-inch mounts. The destroyer ran through the splashes, zigzagging, under fire, and stubbornly closed the range until she reached her own limit. When the lead heavy cruiser Kumano lay about 10 miles off, the outer limit for a 5-inch gun, Hagan opened fire. In 5 minutes, Johnston put more than 200 rounds into Kumano and scored, by various estimates, as many as 45 hits on her superstructure. Those shells could not sink a cruiser. They did not pierce her belt. But they tore away antennas, rangefinders, men at exposed stations, set fire to anything that would burn, and forced the huge ship to flinch and lose its aim. Every hit was not a hole in the side, but a blinded instrument, a killed gun layer, a lost second. Then Johnston closed to torpedo range. At 9,000 yards, Evans fired all 10 torpedoes at once and turned hard behind his own smoke. A minute later, when Johnston came back out of the smoke, the crew saw Kumano burning. 1 or 2 torpedoes had hit the cruiser's bow, and the bow was torn off. Kumano fell out of the fight, and her sister ship Suzuya turned away to cover her. 1 small destroyer had just knocked 2 heavy cruisers out of the Japanese column, and in that very minute, Johnston's luck ran out. The hits landed on Johnston almost together. First 3 shells of 14-inch caliber from the battleship Congo, then 3 6-inch from either a light cruiser or Yamato herself. The 14-inch shell punched through the deck and reached the reduction gears of the port shaft. Another cut the steam lines and the wiring of the after engine room. A 6-inch struck the bridge. Evans was cut by splinters, 2 fingers of his left hand torn off, his clothing stripped to the waist.
The ship lost half her speed and part of her steering. Hagen later described the moment of the hit by saying it looked like somebody was very angry with them. Johnston ducked into a rain squall, and in that short reprieve, the repair parties worked frantically on whatever could still be saved. While they worked, the other destroyers of the screen received Sprague's order to make a torpedo attack. What followed is recorded in naval history as the screen's torpedo attack, but in truth, it was a series of single suicidal charges. Hull, Heermann, and the badly damaged Johnston, who could have left the fight and did not, turned and went at the column of battleships and cruisers a second time. The destroyer Heermann, under Commander Amos Hathaway, was the only one of the 3 destroyers to survive the day.
She fired torpedoes at the heavy cruisers, forced Haruna and other ships to turn away from the torpedo wakes, and at one point passed so close to Johnston in the smoke that the 2 American destroyers nearly rammed each other, missing, by the accounts, by less than 10 feet. Hull, under Commander Leon Kintberger, aimed at the battleship Congo, fired her torpedoes, and forced the giant to turn away. For that, Hull paid with everything. Japanese shells tore her apart. She took more than 40 hits, lost her power, and was shot to pieces at point-blank range from several directions until she rolled over and sank around 8:30 in the morning. Few of her crew survived. Hull did exactly what the destroyers had charged in to do. She made a battleship maneuver, spend minutes and shells not on the carriers but on a single doomed ship. The smallest of all was the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts.
Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, told the crew over the speaker what they already knew, that this was a fight against superior force from which survival was not expected, and that they would do everything they could. Roberts went at the heavy cruiser Chokai under cover of smoke, close to about 2.5 miles under the fire of 8-inch guns, fired her torpedoes, and then fought for nearly an hour with her guns alone. The little ship put more than 600 5-inch rounds into Chokai, set her bridge on fire, and smashed one of her turrets. Then the battleship Congo found the range on Roberts, and 3 14-inch shells were enough. The aftergun was knocked out. One of the gunners, Paul Carr, was found dying at his mount, holding the last round in his hands, begging his shipmates to help him load it into the breech. Roberts went down around 10 in the morning, taking 89 men with her.
A destroyer escort designed to fight submarines and screen convoys had put so many rounds into a heavy cruiser that the American Navy afterward called her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. A ship of about 1,400 tons fought a gun duel with a ship built to take 8-inch fire, and for a short while was winning it. While the destroyers died out front, the Japanese cruisers were working around the smoke from the flank, and only a few miles separated the Japanese from their real target, the carriers. If this story is holding you, subscribing to Victory Vault helps the channel and means you won't miss the next one. While the screen threw itself at the column, the Japanese heavy cruisers flanked them and worked in toward the carriers themselves. Last in Taffy 3's formation came Gambier Bay. Around 8 in the morning, 8-inch shells from the cruiser Chikuma began to fall on her, and then Yamato turned her main battery on the carrier. The thin plating of an escort carrier held nothing. Shells passed clean through her, tore up the engine room, knocked out her speed. Gambier Bay took, by various accounts, at least 15 hits in 40 minutes, lost her power, caught fire, and just after 9 rolled over and sank. She was the only American carrier in the entire war sunk by the gunfire of surface ships. Around 800 of her men ended up in the water. In the air at that same time, the thing that broke the battle for the Japanese was happening. Aircraft from the escort carriers of Taffy 3 and then from the neighboring groups, Taffy 2 and Taffy 1, came up wave after wave and attacked the Japanese cruisers. Many of the pilots had no anti-ship weapons. They had already dropped their bombs on the beach or carried depth charges useless against armor. So they began doing what was written in no manual. They made dry runs. An empty aircraft, screaming low over a bridge, forced a Japanese cruiser to turn, lose its aim, spend minutes. Those who still had something to fight with drove bombs and torpedoes into the superstructures. That unbroken pressure from the air, together with the torpedo charges of the destroyers, built in the Japanese commander's mind the very picture that decided the battle. And the whole thing that morning was decided by one man no American off Samar ever saw face to face, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, an old sailor who had been through Midway, Guadalcanal, and dozens of actions. 2 days before Samar, he had already lived through hell. On October 24th, in the Sibuyan Sea, American carrier aircraft sank his super battleship Musashi, sister to Yamato, putting 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes into her.
That same night, earlier on the approach, his flagship heavy cruiser Atago had been sunk under him by an American submarine, and Kurita had to swim clear and shift his flag to Yamato. On the morning of the 25th, he came out off Samar already battered, his nerves at the edge, after a night passage without sleep. When Kurita saw the ships charging straight at him on the horizon, and the swarms of aircraft in the sky, he reached a conclusion that became his fatal miscalculation. He looked at the escort carriers and took them for full fleet carriers. He looked at the destroyers running suicidal torpedo attacks and decided that only a screen guarding heavy forces would behave so desperately. He put those two errors together and convinced himself of something false. He had not run into a handful of doomed ships. He had run, he believed, into part of Halsey's Third Fleet, the fast carriers and cruisers. That is, into the very force that was at that moment actually steaming farther and farther north after Ozawa's bait. The weakest side looked so desperate that the strongest side took it for the strongest. The enemy miscalculated in exactly what he counted as his opponent's weakness. There was another very human moment. In the thick of the battle, torpedoes fired by the American destroyers ran toward Yamato. To dodge them, the flagship turned and steamed several minutes away from the fight, to the north, holding the torpedoes off her stern until they spent themselves on a parallel course. Those minutes carried the largest battleship in the world out of the action and broke Kurita's grip on the battle. His formation, already turned from an organized strike into a ragged chase, came apart further. The huge firepower that on paper should have crushed Taffy 3 in half an hour was spent in pieces on single targets. By 9:30 in the morning, Kurita held a strange picture.
His cruisers were taking heavy losses. Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya were mortally damaged and would sink during the day or be finished off by their own side, so they would not fall to the enemy. His formation had broken up. He had no contact with Ozawa's force, and he did not know the bait had already done its work and Halsey had gone far north. What he was sure of was that the main strength of the American fleet was somewhere close and about to fall on him with the full weight of its carrier aircraft. Radio reports told him of fresh American carriers to the north. He was low on fuel. And then Kurita made the second decision of the day. He ordered the action broken off and the force to withdraw. At 12:15, the Japanese force turned and headed back toward the San Bernardino Strait. At that moment, almost nothing stood between Kurita and the defenseless transports at Leyte. The thin line of Taffy 3, at the cost of 3 screening ships sunk and 1 carrier, had made him believe that pressing on meant throwing away the remnants of the Japanese battle line for nothing, against a fleet that was no longer even there. The ships he had taken for the bait of a mighty force were in fact everything standing between him and his goal. He never learned that on the day. And Johnston, in those same minutes, was living out her last. After Evans had fired all his torpedoes, the destroyer was left with 1 working gun and 1 engine. She could have tried to leave the fight. Instead, Evans turned her back and went once more to cover the carriers and the other destroyers with gunfire. He saw the Japanese had found the range on Gambier Bay and ordered fire on the heavy cruiser to draw its guns onto himself, away from the carrier. Hagen later called that the bravest order he ever heard. A crippled destroyer deliberately drawing fire onto itself to win minutes for the ship behind it. By 9:30, Johnston could barely move. And around her, the Japanese destroyers and cruisers had gathered. They came on in a half circle and hit her from every side. Steering had to be shifted by hand to the stern, communications were gone, the bridge was wrecked. The wounded Evans moved to the after steering station and shouted orders through a hatch to the men hauling the rudder by hand. The ship lost way, and gun after gun fell silent under the hits. At 9:45, Evans gave the order a captain gives hardest of all: abandon ship. At 10:10, Johnston rolled over and went down. The survivors would carry one image for the rest of their lives. As Johnston went under, a Japanese destroyer came up to about 1,000 yards. At first, the men in the water thought they were about to be machine-gunned, and many of them had seen, in this war, both sides finish off men in the water. Japanese sailors lined the rail, but there were no weapons in their hands. And then the survivors watched the captain of the Japanese ship, in his white uniform, step out onto the bridge wing and salute the sinking American destroyer. By one account, the ship was the destroyer Yukikaze. The enemy was rendering military honors to a ship that had just thrown itself at his fleet, 1 against 23. Samar produced one more grim first. Around 11 in the morning, Japanese aircraft appeared over the escort carriers and behaved unlike ordinary bombers. They did not drop their bombs and pull away. They aimed their machines straight at the decks. These were the first organized kamikaze attacks in history. One of them, flown by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, struck the deck of the escort carrier St. Lo. Bombs and aviation fuel detonated inside. St. Lo caught fire, was torn apart by a series of explosions, and sank. She became the first major ship sunk by a kamikaze attack. Taffy 3, having already survived the impossible in a gun battle, met that same morning the birth of a weapon that would torment the American fleet to the very end of the war. And the men were left in the water. Survivors from Johnston, Hull, Roberts, and Gambier Bay clung to rafts and floater nets in the open ocean. Rescue did not come quickly. Through confusion in the command and an error in the coordinates passed along, the rescue ships did not reach the right area until many hours later. Men spent up to 2 days and more in the water. They watched the rafts thin out around them as the hours passed. Some were carried off by the current, beyond shouting distance, and then beyond sight. Some died of their wounds and slid out of their life jackets. And sharks moved through the groups in the daylight and took men one at a time, so that the survivors learned to bunch together and kick at the water and not let anyone drift alone. One Johnston survivor, an 18-year-old seaman, remembered taking off the life jacket of a friend who had died and watching the empty preserver sink. When the rescue ships finally came, they pulled the living out one by one. Of Johnston's crew of 327, 141 were saved. Of the 186 lost, about 50 were killed in the battle itself, 45 died of wounds on the rafts, and 92, including Commander Evans, were alive in the water after the ship went down but were never seen again. The arithmetic of that last group is the hardest part of the story. Those were not men killed by shellfire. Those were men who survived the battle, survived the sinking, and were lost in the days it took to find them. Evans was last seen in the water among other sailors. Whether the Japanese picked him up, whether he died of his wounds, whether the current carried him out to open sea, is unknown to this day. His body was never found. His name is cut into the walls of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery. For that battle, Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor and became the first Native American in the United States Navy to receive it. His Johnston lay undiscovered on the bottom for 76 years, until in 2019, a deep-sea expedition found the wreck at a depth of more than 21,000 feet. It is the deepest shipwreck ever located. By her hull number, 557, the ship was positively identified in 2021. The whole surface action lasted only about 90 minutes. Into that hour and a half, the numbers crowd together in a way that is hard to take in. On the American side, 1,161 men were killed or went missing, and 913 more were wounded. The bulk of those losses fell on a force of 13 ships, most of them small. The death toll of that single morning was close to the combined American losses at Coral Sea and Midway put together. two of the most famous carrier battles of the Pacific. On the other side of the ledger, the cost to Kurita was just as severe. Three of his heavy cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, were sunk in the action by the combined weight of airstrikes and the gunnery and torpedoes of those little ships. A fourth, Kumano, limped home with her bow blown off. Japanese casualties ran past 2,700 killed and wounded. A force of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, with an almost defenseless target in front of it and an open road to the transports at Leyte, turned around and left. The Leyte landing was saved. The thin little escort group, built for patrols and infantry support, had stopped the strongest surface fleet Japan could still assemble at the end of the war. Not because it was stronger, because in the enemy's eyes it looked stronger than it was. Because the enemy could not believe that what stood in front of him was only an escort. The decisive battle of the largest battleships, the one both navies had spent 20 years preparing for, never came. Kurita turned for home before it could. The man whose decision settled everything had a long life after that morning. After the war, Kurita was criticized at length for turning away off Samar and never reaching the transports. He was called indecisive, cautious, timid. In 1946, an American officer, Thomas Moorer, questioned Kurita in his garden and asked what had finally destroyed the Japanese Navy. Kurita answered briefly, "We ran out of oil." For many years, he explained almost nothing more. Only at the very end of his life, in December of 1977, just days before his death, did he tell his former students from the Naval Academy the real reason he turned away. He said he saw no point in leading more than 20,000 of his own sailors to a meaningless death against an American fleet he was certain was bearing down on him. Kurita died quietly in his sleep 3 days after that conversation at the age of 88. Ernest Evans drove his destroyer to certain death to win minutes for the men he was covering, and those minutes in the end saved thousands. Takeo Kurita turned away from the battle so as not to lead his own men to a meaningless death, and that turn saved the very landing he had come to destroy.
Two commanders, two opposite decisions on the same morning, and both of them, each in his own way, in his final minute, were thinking about the people in his charge. The weakest force of that day beat the strongest fleet because one man on the bridge of the largest battleship in the world looked at a handful of doomed men and could not believe that they were all that stood in his way. If this story got to you, like and subscribe to Victory Vault. That way you won't miss the next one.